On the night of March 7th, 1945, as a cold wind swept across the Rhine River in war-torn Germany, German sentries peering through the darkness witnessed something that should have been impossible. Through the fog and shadows, they could make out the silhouettes of what appeared to be an entire American division crossing the river at Remagen, where the famous Ludendorff Bridge had been captured intact just hours earlier. The sound of vehicles, the movement of troops, the mechanical noise of a major river-crossing operation filled the night air. German artillery immediately began targeting the crossing site, and urgent reports were radioed to headquarters describing a massive American breakthrough that threatened to tear open the entire German defensive line. But those German observers were witnessing something that existed only in their minds. A phantom created by one of the most ingenious deception operations of the Second World War. The ghost division they thought they saw crossing the Rhine was the brainchild of Colonel Hilton Railey, a former journalist turned military intelligence officer who understood that in warfare, what the enemy believes to be true can be more important than what actually is true. Railey had grown up in small-town Texas, where his father ran the local newspaper and taught him that the power of information lay not just in what you reported, but in how you presented it and what you chose to emphasize or omit. After college, he had worked as a correspondent covering conflicts around the world, learning to observe human nature under extreme stress and understanding how people made decisions based on incomplete information. When America entered the war, Railey's unique combination of journalistic experience and understanding of human psychology made him invaluable. To military intelligence planners, the situation facing American forces in March 1945 was both promising and perilous. The capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen had given Allied forces their first intact crossing of the Rhine, Hitler's last major natural defensive barrier. But the bridge was damaged and could collapse at any moment, and German forces were desperately trying to destroy it before significant American forces could cross and establish a permanent foothold on the eastern bank. The real American strategy was to get as many troops across the bridge as quickly as possible while simultaneously preventing German forces from concentrating enough firepower to either destroy the bridge or eliminate the small bridgehead that had been established. This meant that American commanders needed to convince the Germans that the crossing at Remagen was much larger and more significant than it actually was, drawing German attention and resources away from other potential crossing sites where the main Allied advance would actually take place. Railey proposed something audacious. Instead of trying to hide the American presence at Remagen, they would make it appear much larger and more threatening than reality, using a combination of electronic deception, acoustic manipulation, and psychological warfare. They would create the impression that an entire army corps was crossing at Remagen, when in fact only a few battalions had actually made it across before the bridge became too dangerous to use. The technical aspects of the deception were revolutionary. Railey's team used portable loudspeakers positioned around the crossing site to broadcast recordings of tank engines, truck convoys, and marching troops. These weren't simple sound effects. They were carefully orchestrated acoustic illusions designed to create the impression of specific types of military units moving in realistic patterns. The sounds of Sherman tanks were mixed with the noise of supply trucks, engineering equipment, and the general cacophony of a major river-crossing operation. But sound alone wasn't enough to fool experienced German observers. The deception also included visual elements. Searchlights swept the river in patterns that suggested major nighttime operations, while small boats moved back and forth across the water, creating wake patterns that would be visible to enemy observation posts. Smoke generators created the kind of concealment that would be expected during a real crossing operation, while simultaneously hiding the fact that the actual number of troops and vehicles was much smaller than the sound suggested. The radio deception was perhaps the most sophisticated element of the entire operation. Railey's communication specialists created an entire fake radio network, broadcasting the kind of traffic that would be expected from a division-sized unit conducting a major river crossing. Orders were transmitted for non-existent battalions, supply requests were made for phantom companies, and coordination messages were sent between fictional commanders, all designed to create the electronic signature of a major military operation. The psychological dimension of the deception drew on Railey's deep understanding of how people process information under stress. He knew that German commanders, faced with reports of a major American crossing at Remagen, would make predictable decisions based on their training and doctrine. They would assume that any crossing in strength would be quickly reinforced, that American forces would attempt to exploit any breakthrough as rapidly as possible, and that the greatest threat to German defensive positions would come from the most obvious crossing point. So the Ghost Division was designed to confirm German expectations and fears. Every element of the deception reinforced the impression that American forces were doing exactly what German doctrine predicted they would do, concentrating maximum force at the point of breakthrough and preparing to exploit their success with overwhelming numbers and firepower. The human drama behind the deception was as compelling as its strategic impact. The soldiers participating in the operation understood that they were engaged in an elaborate performance, but they also knew that their performance might mean the difference between life and death for thousands of their fellow Americans. Every sound effect had to be perfectly timed, every radio transmission had to be convincing, and every visual element had to contribute to an overall illusion that could withstand the scrutiny of experienced German intelligence officers. The results exceeded all expectations. German forces, convinced that a major American breakthrough was underway at Remagen, rushed reinforcements to contain what they believed was the primary Allied crossing. Artillery units were repositioned to target the Phantom Division, air assets were diverted to attack the fake concentration, and mobile reserves were committed to countering a threat that existed only in American imaginations. Meanwhile, the real Allied crossing operations were taking place at other points along the Rhine, where German defenses had been weakened by the rush to contain the Ghost Division at Remagen. American forces were able to establish multiple bridgeheads with minimal opposition, effectively ending German hopes of maintaining a coherent defensive line along the river. The emotional weight of the operation stayed with its participants for decades. These men had grown up in an America that valued honesty and straightforward dealing, but they found themselves engaged in an elaborate campaign of lies and misdirection. Yet they also understood that in the context of a war against an enemy that had committed atrocities across Europe, such deception was not only justified but morally necessary to save lives and bring the conflict to a swifter conclusion. The German response to the Ghost Division revealed both the effectiveness of the deception and the desperate situation facing German forces. By early 1945, intercepted radio communications showed that German commanders were increasingly relying on fragmentary and often contradictory intelligence reports, making them more susceptible to the kind of comprehensive deception that Railey's team had created. One of the most remarkable aspects of the operation was how it evolved in real time as German reactions became apparent. When American intelligence intercepted German communications indicating that enemy forces were being moved to counter the perceived threat at Remagen, Railey's team intensified their deception, adding new sound effects and radio traffic to maintain the impression of a growing American buildup. The success of the Ghost Division operation influenced American military thinking for the remainder of the war and beyond. It demonstrated that in modern warfare, perception could be as important as reality, and that skilled deception operations could multiply the effectiveness of real military forces by creating confusion and misdirection in enemy planning. After the war, many details of the Rhine crossing deceptions remained classified for years. Railey returned to journalism, but he carried with him the knowledge that his understanding of human psychology and information warfare had contributed to one of the final major Allied victories in Europe. The Ghost Division that had never existed had played a real role in hastening the end of the war. The bridge at Remagen itself collapsed just days after the deception operation, but by then it had served its purpose. Real American forces had established permanent footholds across the Rhine at multiple points, and German resistance was crumbling as their forces were scattered and confused by phantom threats that drew them away from the actual battles that mattered. Today, when military historians analyze the final months of the war in Europe, they often focus on the conventional battles and the movement of real armies across the landscape of defeated Germany. But the story of the Ghost Division reminds us that some of the most important victories were won not through firepower and maneuver, but through the careful manipulation of enemy perceptions and the creation of threats that existed only in the imagination.